Specialist Dave Olson from the Nebraska Forest Service. He will be discussing some of our common tree problems and give some information on treatments. And I just wanted to give a quick note to everybody. Your mics are muted and videos are off. However, if you have a question, I'll be turning on the Q&A function, so you can always write those in there. And then at the end, we will have a live Q&A. So I'll be doing that for you now. And Dave, if you're ready to get started.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yep.
Let's make sure I can share the screen here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Olson. I work for the Nebraska Forest Service. I'm based out of Lincoln. Forest health specialist. My background is actually a little bit more in entomology, so I'm usually the bug guy. My supervisor usually deals more with the funguses and stuff like that. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the common pests that we might see with trees, but also about increasing tree canopy and some issues that we're kind of identifying within the state of Nebraska and kind of in the nation as a whole, just with urban tree canopy, and then dealing with some of those pests that might arise or that you might be seeing quite often. So everyone knows that tree canopy is important. That's no surprise. Nebraska is the Arbor Day state. It's where Arbor Day really started, and once upon a time, we were planting more trees than most other states were. But unfortunately, we've been losing a lot of tree canopy cover. Some of that is due to things like invasive insects. The emerald ash borer, which is now in the Lincoln, Omaha, Fremont areas, kind of in between those areas as well, has been killing off a lot of ash trees in those communities and is expected to eventually spread across the rest of the state. So we're going to lose a lot of ash trees from that, which make up a hugely significant portion of a lot of urban tree canopies. And then we know that we've also been losing trees in areas like windbreaks. A lot of farms have been removing windbreaks, or windbreaks get old and they're dying off and need to be replanted. And as a result of losing those windbreaks, we're now seeing things like the dust storm pictured here that occurred off of I-80 just a few years ago. So Nebraska now is unfortunately one of the top states for reduction in tree canopy each year. So it's becoming very clear that we need to be replacing some of our aging tree canopy, some of the ones that are getting lost to things like diseases and pests out there. And it's really trying to encourage people to start planting trees where they're able to get that back up. So trees provide a number of resources. We know this. We know that trees are good for a number of things. They look nice. You know, people want them in their yards. They can provide benefits through things like windbreaks, protecting cattle and crops. But they also have a lot of things that people don't realize as well. The tag pictured here was kind of an effort. This one's from the Morton Arboretum, kind of an effort just to show people. They can tie this around the tree and put a number value on it to show people how much this tree is actually providing in different benefits. And some of that can actually be seen by homeowners. So trees have been shown to drastically increase home values. When you have a well-maintained mature tree on your property, it can greatly increase your home value versus a home without any trees around it, without any sort of landscaping. Stormwater, the amount of stormwater runoff is greatly reduced by trees, large part because the trees will just slow that rain down on the way to the impervious surfaces that are pretty common in cities, and also because they'll be taking some of it up as well. Energy savings, we know that trees save a lot in terms of energy. Depending on what kind of tree you plant and where, you can reduce your cooling bills in the summer. Some trees like evergreens can actually hold heat in, so you can reduce your heating values in the winter. And trees can really help with energy savings at homes and businesses. And then, of course, the numerous ecological benefits that trees provide. Trees can provide huge roles in the ecosystem just for habitat for different forms of wildlife, pollination. A lot of people don't realize that trees have flowers and provide a lot of pollen to different species of bees and other things that are feeding on that out there. And there's multiple different ways you can actually, if you have a tree in your yard or on your property, there's a lot of different calculators out there online. If you just go and search, it'll allow you to put in some pretty basic information about your tree. You might have to take a measurement or two of just the diameter of the trunk, and it'll actually give you a rough estimate of how much that tree is saving you per year. A lot of really cool tools out there. But we know that trees are important and that they provide a lot of benefits to our urban and more rural ecosystems. So if we know the trees are good, the next question is, well, what trees do we plant? You know, back in the day, we used to just find 1 or 2 good trees, and it was like, this tree grows really well, we're going to plant lots of it. We know better than that now, or we try to know better than that now, because trees can vary a lot in how big they get and what functions they're providing. So there's a few things to consider when we're looking for certain trees to plant. The first thing is going to be size. You know, we don't want to plant a tree that's going to grow into a giant shade tree in an area where you have power lines overhead, or some area maybe where it's, you know, surrounded by concrete. You have to be aware of the full mature size of a tree when you're planting it, not planting something that's going to be huge in something that an ornamental might do better in. The overall function of the tree is important as well. What are you actually looking to get out of that tree, right? Are you looking for something that's going to act as a shade tree? Because then you might not want to be planting something that's only going to get, you know, 20 feet tall. You're looking for something more like an oak or a maple, or something that's going to grow big. Are you looking for something that's going to attract certain species of birds? Are you looking for wildlife, things that are going to feed turkey, deer, things like that? All important things to consider when you're looking to plant a tree. The habitat is also important. You know, there's a lot of, you go to the store, big box store, even some nurseries, and you see sometimes a lot of different trees, and some of them are really cool looking, but that doesn't always mean that they're the best suited for Nebraska's climate. Nebraska can be pretty rough on trees sometimes. And it's just best to select a tree that's actually going to do well in that habitat. And then the big thing that we're really trying to get at recently is diversity, especially in urban environments and landscapes. We know that diversity is a good thing from an ecological standpoint, but unfortunately in a lot of our urban areas and even in smaller towns, we tend to not see very much diversity in terms of tree canopy. We tend to see 1 or 2 species really dominating the plantings, which can lead to a lot of problems later on. So we've been in this situation before where we've had just 1 or 2 types of trees that we've really planted a lot of and kind of thought, this tree grows great, let's just plant a ton of it. But we've also learned that that leads to a lot of problems. So in the left-hand corner there, you see kind of that old picture. That's a street that was lined with American elms. And American elms are kind of the first major example of why we should have been increasing tree diversity. And we didn't really listen. So American elms were a great tree, had a perfect kind of vase shape to them, didn't break too much, grew really well in hard urban environments, didn't require much care, so we kept planting them. Unfortunately, in the early 20th century, something called Dutch elm disease came in and started wiping out all American elm trees. In Nebraska, it got here, about 40, 50 years ago. And you'll still see some large American elms around Nebraska because you can protect them with certain fungicides. But for the most part, we don't see many American elms anymore. And then, of course, this led to a lot of trees having to be taken down all at once. So we lose a huge amount of tree canopy all at once when we set ourselves up for something like this, where we just plant 1 species, and then all it takes is 1 invasive species or an outbreak of even a native species of insect or fungus to wipe out huge numbers of trees. We should have learned from that. Unfortunately, we didn't. We did the same exact thing with another tree, green ash. We said, hey, green ash has a really good shape to it. It grows really well in urban environments. Let's plant lots of green ash. And that worked well up until about 2002 when emerald ash borer showed up in Michigan. And now we have huge lines of ash trees and streets that are going to have to come down. This picture is actually from kind of the Michigan, Ohio area that's showing all dead trees. Those are all going to have to come down. And these are things that are not only reducing our urban canopy in the long run, but they're leading to much higher municipal budgets to have to take the trees down. A lot of trees are on private property of these species that are going to require homeowners to shell out potentially thousands of dollars to have some of these large trees removed. And so it's really vital moving forward that we don't make these same mistakes again, and that we're diversifying fortifying our urban canopy so that if another pest comes in, we're not going to have this massive die-off of our trees. Unfortunately, we are kind of making the same mistake again. There's two species I'm going to kind of pick on a little bit here. The Bradford or Callery pear, which is the white flowering tree there, and then the autumn blaze maple, or kind of just red and silver maples in general. We tend to see a lot of these now in urban environments. And I'll talk about it shortly with the Bradford pear there, why that's kind of becoming even a bigger problem. But once again, we're planting a lot of these trees because they look really nice. They grow pretty well and everyone wants them. But what we're really doing is getting way too many of a single species or a single genus in the city, so much that they're making up a huge percentage of that urban canopy. And it's going to end up causing problems later on down the road. So as far as tree diversity goes, there's a few trees that are kind of becoming problematic that we're seeing a lot. The first one's maple, as I mentioned. Now, this doesn't include all maples, but remember, when we say maples, we pretty much mean everything in the Acer genus. So it's just one genus. But the big one is the autumn blaze, because a lot of people like this tree. It's a very beautiful tree. It has that red, almost fire-like fall color. Unfortunately, it's getting very, very overplanted to the point now where you go into a lot of neighborhoods and all you see are maples. With maple in particular, this is a problem because we actually have an invasive insect in the United States that could lead to kind of a catastrophic scenario, much like we saw with Dutch elm disease or with emerald ash borer. And that's the Asian longhorn beetle. You might have heard about this. It's kind of contained right now in a few outbreak spots in Ohio, New York, one up in Canada, I believe, New Hampshire. But its favorite tree to eat is maple. And if that should get out and become uncontrollable, we're going to lose all our maple trees. And it would be a lot better if that made up a smaller percentage of the canopy than you know, up to 20% in some communities are made up of these kind of red maple hybrids. The Callery pear, I kind of mentioned a little bit already. The Callery pear is kind of an interesting one. We have sort of been shying away from that, which is really good, but that's a tree that everyone, including cities and towns, really love to plant because it has those nice white showy flowers. Unfortunately, those flowers kind of smell like rotting fish, some people describe it as. Some people describe it as dog poop. They're actually pollinated by flies, so they don't smell very good. They also, I think this next slide shows it, have a really terrible branching structure. So I like to say they kind of self-destruct after about 2 or so decades. This isn't terribly uncommon. This is actually my hometown back in New York. Nice Callery pear there that you could see cars through the other side, through the fence on the other side of the road through. And that's not terribly uncommon for Callery pears just due to their branching structure. The other problem that we're seeing a lot of with Callery pear, and they're now discovering a lot more of, is that it's turning into an invasive species. So a lot of the planted and cultivated ones are actually reproducing with each other, and the seeds are getting dispersed by birds and starting to pop up in fields and other areas, which would be bad enough. In some areas in the east, it's very bad. We've actually identified a few populations in Nebraska, especially in the Lincoln area, where it's kind of getting out of control in some places. But the wild cultivar of Callery pears also develop about 4-inch long thorns that can puncture tractor tires. So definitely a species that we want to see less of because it's starting to become invasive and problematic. Now, 2 others I just wanted to mention because we're seeing a lot of these. They're not necessarily overplanted, but probably go with a different option. The linden, which is the leaves are pictured on the right-hand side there. Lindens grow really well in a lot of different environments, a lot of different places in Nebraska, but unfortunately, because of Japanese beetle, another invasive insect, they tend to get hammered quite a bit. Japanese beetles are defoliators, so they're eating the leaves, and they tend to completely defoliate some of these trees during the summer. Usually isn't a huge threat to the tree's health unless it keeps getting defoliated year after year, but generally doesn't look very good. And as long as we've been planting kind of too many of them, it's best to probably find something different. Now, if you must have a linden, I have heard that Japanese beetle prefer the little leaf linden over the silver leaf, and then the Americans kind of somewhere in the middle. So probably, I would say definitely shying away from that little leaf if you do choose to go with a linden. Blue spruce is another one that we're seeing kind of way too many of, we feel, in a lot of areas. A lot of people like it because it's got that nice blue color. Unfortunately, we see a lot of blue spruce that are about 20 years old or so that are having their tops die back, branches die back. Blue spruce are susceptible to a few different things. There's a few different needle casts, which are fungal diseases of the needles. They also get a fungal canker, which is kind of a death sentence for the tree. But the bigger thing I think going on with blue spruce is they became so popular, and we're seeing so many of them now in people's yards and things like that, that oftentimes the ones that came from big box stores or places like that tended to have root systems that weren't really good to begin with. And I think what we're seeing is the result of those bad root systems just eventually taking their toll on the tree. Now, spruce can be a great tree in a lot of places. I would recommend going with two other kinds of spruce besides blue spruce, just to get some more diversity out there. The Norway spruce does really well in Nebraska, and another really cool spruce tree is actually the Black Hills white spruce, which white spruce is a tree that should be nowhere near Nebraska, but there's kind of this remnant population up in the Black Hills that they've been able to breed out, so it's really well accustomed to Nebraska's environment. So two cool kind of species to as an option for blue spruce there to increase diversity a little bit. Already showed the Callery pear with its poor branching habit. Now, another reason to increase diversity, I'm just going to go over a few problems that we tend to see a lot in trees. These are probably some of the most common ones. The first one's going to be chlorosis. Chlorosis, if you've ever been driving down the road and you've seen, probably a pin oak is the most likely culprit of this. You've been driving down the road, it's middle of summer, and you see a tree that looks almost yellow or lime green. That is probably chlorosis. Chlorosis is usually easily identified just by kind of a yellow to lime green leaf, and you'll see here on this maple that the veins are actually still a darker color. Now, chlorosis is caused by some sort of nutrient deficiency. It can be any number of nutrient deficiencies. There's lots of different macronutrients, different elements that trees need in relatively small amounts, and if they're not getting them, they can develop different symptoms. Usually when we see this, it's caused by iron deficiency. And in Nebraska, this generally happens, especially in the eastern part of the state. We tend to have very alkaline soils, meaning the soils have a really high pH. And when they have that high pH, some tree species will have a hard time actually getting iron in its soluble form. It doesn't mean there's not iron in the soil. It just means that it's inaccessible to the tree due to the pH of the soil. Pin oak, we see this a lot. We really don't recommend planting pin oak anymore just because it's so poor at getting that iron out of the soil in those high pH environments. A lot of red oaks also go along with that. Swamp white oak seems to struggle with it a little bit. Maples, we'll often see a lot of it on maples as well. Some species to plant that do better. So we say don't plant red oaks in those high alkaline soils. Usually that doesn't do too well. A lot of the white oaks do though, barring swamp white. But like chinkapin oak does particularly well. Bur oak will do pretty well. So in this case, it's more about matching the tree to its surroundings. Now, chlorosis can be corrected in a way by applying soluble iron to the soil or injecting the tree directly. If you do that, it's going to have to be something that's done every year, every couple of years for the rest of the life of the tree. It's going to need to keep getting kind of these supplemental soluble iron. You can also try to correct the pH of the soil, although that's not very easy. Some people do have success with sulfate applications to the soil, but generally not super effective, pretty hard to actually change the pH of the soil. So in a lot of cases, you're better off just going with a species that's going to do better in those high alkaline soils. Now, as I mentioned, it's not always iron either. In order to tell what's truly affecting a tree to actually treat it, you would have to do both a soil and a foliar tissue analysis and run it for those different elements to see what the levels are to find out what the tree is actually lacking in that case. One other thing to mention with chlorosis too is we see it often with overwatering being an issue. So that's one thing we see quite often is people overwatering their trees. Trees only need about, we say about 1 inch of water if you're in clay soil, about 2 inches if you're in sandy soil a week if it hasn't rained. So any more than that, you can start to see problems, particularly in western Nebraska. We tend to see chlorosis when the tree is getting too much water, just because that water is flushing out some of those nutrients that that tree needs. In those cases where it is water causing it, then just backing off on the water will often lead to a drastic improvement with the tree. The other major problem that I wanted to talk about are bagworms. This is kind of everyone's favorite one to hate because they seem to be getting worse and worse. Bagworms are actually a native insect, but their populations certainly seem to be getting higher. We had quite a few of them in the Lincoln and Omaha areas last year. We've now found them in Nebraska as far west as just outside of McCook. So it does seem like they're spreading a little bit going west. They can get on any number of trees. I have seen them on maple, honey locust, they seem to get on quite a bit, crabapple. Usually they're not going to be a problem if they're on a deciduous tree. If they're on, you know, our big broadleaf deciduous trees, they might be eating a few leaves. That tree's probably going to do fine. Generally with bagworms, we start to worry when we see too many of them on things like cedars and spruces, occasionally pines, those conifers. And the reason for that is because conifers usually keep several years worth of needles. They're not going to shed and regrow all of their needles like deciduous trees do within a year. So a maple gets defoliated by bagworms. It's going to come back next spring. It'll probably be fine. A cedar gets completely defoliated by bagworms. It's probably dead. So with things like cedar and spruce especially, it's good to keep an eye out for bagworms. One of the most effective controls for bagworms, if you have a relatively small tree, is to simply pick the bags off in the dormant season. So we're kind of approaching the end of that dormant season now. Bagworms tend to hatch around late May to early June. So anytime from about mid-October up until about now, you can actually go out and remove the bags by hand and then just dispose of them in a trash bag, haul them off site, a bucket of soapy water. Some people get quite a bit of enjoyment from burning them, I think, out of spite. But any way that you can destroy or get those bags off the prop or away from the tree. Don't just pick them and leave them on the ground. If you do that, the caterpillars are just going to hatch out in the spring and climb right back up the tree. Now, it's also important to monitor the tree for bagworms too. Bagworms are a caterpillar, and what actually happens is the females kind of mummify themselves in the bags in the fall. The male is actually long gone. He doesn't overwinter. He hatches out of his bag after he pupates and goes and finds the female and reproduces, then dies. The female kind of mummifies herself around the eggs, and those eggs are actually what overwinter, and there can be up to 300 eggs in one bag of a bagworm. Starting in about late May to early June, those eggs will actually hatch out, and then the larva will do this thing called ballooning, where they're actually going to throw a thread of silk, because they're a caterpillar, out, and that's going to catch the wind, and then they're going to travel with that downwind until they find a suitable host. So if your tree keeps getting reinfested from year after year, you probably have an infestation somewhere that you're downwind of and that you're getting a lot of bagworms from. Now, late May to early June is going to be the time when you want to be actually out looking for these bagworms. The earlier you can treat them, the better, and the more effective your treatment is going to be. The larger they get, the harder it's going to be to treat for them. A good indicator is right around the time the catalpa trees are blooming. That's usually when we start to see bagworms emerging, and they're very, very tiny when they come out. Now, you can spray for them if populations are bad enough. If it's a pretty big spray, I would usually recommend something like BT or Spinosad. These are actually classified as organic insecticides. BT, for example, is actually a bacterium that will get in and it kind of ruptures the gut of the insect and kills it that way. But the good thing about these is they're generally more specific to certain types of insects, so they're not going to harm a lot of our beneficial insects out there in the environment, and they're certainly going to have almost zero toxicity to things like birds and mammals and you and your pets and things like that. With BT and spinosad, you might have to do 2 applications in a year just to get good control. If it does get later in the year, you'll probably want to go with something a little bit more aggressive. Something like carbaryl might be required, especially if they're really doing a lot of damage to the tree. But with bagworms too, you also want to catch them early, because we'll get a lot of calls about what can I do about bagworms, and the tree's pretty much already defoliated. And it's like, well, at that point, there's not much you can do. The tree's pretty much dead. So definitely something to stay on top of and keep an eye out for, because they can be treated if they're caught early, and the earlier you get them, the easier it will be to manage. Aside from insects in funguses and things like that, there's a whole bunch of them out there. But for the most part, we like to say that in a lot of cases, our native insects and our native fungal pathogens don't become a real problem unless they're invasive, something like the emerald ash borer, where our trees have no defense against them, or unless they build into an outbreak population, which happens, with bark beetles, not too much in Nebraska. But the other reason we tend to see these problems on trees are because they're taking advantage of an abiotic problem. They're taking advantage of a tree that's already experiencing stress. If a tree is under stress, it's not going to be able to defend itself as well, because it's not going to be able to allocate resources to its defense. So a lot of times when we go out and we see a tree that's getting attacked by something and it's a native pest, we start looking around for other things that might have started what is called the death spiral of the tree, started it on this downward path that eventually ends in the tree's death. One of the most common things that we see are trees being planted too deeply. In this picture, you can see where that person's hand is actually where the soil level was, and where it's been excavated to is actually where it should be. This can happen for a variety of reasons. A lot of times trees in nurseries have soil piled up around them for various reasons, whether that's just in the process of getting them out of the nursery or ready for shipping, or protect them from some colder environments or to overwinter. But what we always tell people is, if you get a tree from a nursery, be sure that you're digging down around that soil on the trunk until you start to find the root flare, which is where we see the buttress roots kind of coming out from the tree. A tree should have a nice taper going into the ground. It shouldn't look like a telephone pole stuck straight into the ground. So that's usually what happens in a lot of cases, is just soil getting piled on at the nursery level and then not getting excavated before it gets planted. You'll see this a lot too, just in quick plantings for large projects. Sometimes the hole's too deep and the tree gets planted too deeply, but we always want to have that nice taper on the trunk. We don't want to see trees planted too deeply. Another common thing that happens with this is the mulch volcano, as we like to call it. Mulching is great for trees, especially in Nebraska, because mulch acts kind of as a slow release fertilizer. It helps to retain moisture for the roots so you don't have to water as often. And it also helps to prevent for a number of other things. But unfortunately, you can have too much mulch. We call this a mulch volcano because it kind of looks like the tree is erupting out of the mulch. Whenever you mulch, you want to make sure that the mulch actually isn't up against the trunk of the tree. It doesn't need to be right against the trunk of the tree. When that happens, you'll often get moisture that's held in there, and that'll start to cause decay problems within the tree. The tree will get stressed out. You can get funguses that'll start growing in there. The tree will start rotting. It's not uncommon to see this on large trees, where the tree actually blows over in a storm and it turns out like the whole trunk base was rotted because of this. And this will also invite things like rodents into there to make their nests as well. So when you mulch, generally we say about 1 to 4 inches deep of mulch. You don't want to go much deeper than that. If you can, take it out to the drip line of the tree, out to where the branches are. Most lawns, that's not always feasible. That's kind of the ideal scenario. But always just make sure that that mulch isn't piled up against the trunk of the tree. You should still be able to see that trunk flare, that nice kind of tapering out of the tree with the mulch around it. Another common problem that we see, and this again kind of goes back to the nursery level, are girdling roots. And this is whenever we have a root on a tree that sort of starts to wind around the tree. Now, in a lot of cases, this happens because the tree was container grown and it was in that container for too long and the roots started going around and around and around. And this is why we always tell people, when you go to plant a tree, you go to buy a tree, always inspect the roots of the tree that you're going to be buying. You should always be inspecting it, taking it out of the pot, looking at those roots. Now, a lot of us, if we work in gardens and things like that, when we see it on just, flowers that are going to die in a year, it's good to see all those roots. But in a tree, that's not always good. What we want to see are roots going straight out. If they're circling around, what happens is those roots never straighten out unless you are able actually to straighten them out. And that's fine for the short term. The tree will probably do fine for about a decade or so. But after that time, as the tree starts expanding, its trunk grows into those roots, and the roots grow into the trunk, and it sort of chokes it off from underneath the ground and girdles the tree. Unfortunately, by the time that we find this, there's usually not that much that can be done for the tree with girdling roots. Sometimes if you catch it when it's small, the roots can be pruned out, or if you're planting, you can certainly try to straighten those roots out that are winding around or prune them off. But in most cases, we just tell people, really inspect trees carefully when you're going to buy them from the nursery. Make sure you don't have girdling roots set up. And there's a lot of actually great new methods out there for growing nursery trees that are trying to limit this problem too. But this is a very common problem that we see with trees, that they'll grow for about 10, 20 years just fine, and then we'll start to see problems from this. And lastly, one of the big problems that I wanted to talk about as far as abiotic, what we affectionately call mower blight. So blights are usually fungus things going on with the tree. We call this mower blight because this is usually what happens when someone's gotten too close with the deck of the mower or a string trimmer or something like that. This poor ash tree here, you can see he's got quite a large wound right there, and that's probably just from the deck of the mower or the wheel of the mower continually hitting that like week after week every year. Trees don't like that. They have bark to protect them, but if they get hit enough times, they're going to get wounded. And it's important to realize that with trees, they don't actually heal like we do. They just seal off damage. They have no way of actually healing that damaged tissue. They just try to seal it off as much as possible to prevent further decay. So when this keeps happening to the tree, it's certainly going to cause some decline in the tree, because the tree is going to be under continual stress because it thinks that it keeps getting attacked. And it can also cause quite a few problems into the future as well. This spot here on this ash tree would open up a huge opportunity for decay to enter the tree, which could affect the structure of the tree as well, structural stability of the tree. And there are some ways to prevent this. Generally, what we recommend is just mulching. So mulching is good for the health of the tree, not only because it's releasing nutrients and holding in water, but also because it'll help to keep things like mowers away from the base of the tree. And that's really big, especially when the trees are young. Often we see a lot of ash trees like this just because there's too many of them planted where they have a large wound like this from mower blight, and they're often getting really, really heavily attacked by a lot of our native ash borers as well. So definitely something to try and steer clear of. Just simply mulching or creating some sort of a barrier can help a lot with mower blight. So as far as abiotic problems go, there's a few things to remember. We always say this a lot: right tree, right place. So it's important that when we plant a tree, or we have an area that we want to plant a tree in, we're matching a tree to that environment. We're not trying to match the environment to the tree. If we're trying to match the environment to the tree, it's going to be very hard to do in a lot of cases. It can require quite a bit of work, and it probably won't end up working. In this case, this tree is planted, it's a larger shade tree that's planted in this little tiny, probably not even 3 by 3 foot square of soil. That tree's not going to do too well. That would probably do better with some small ornamental, or even perhaps a shrub in that case. It's much easier and much cheaper in the long run to match a tree to the environment rather than trying to do it vice versa. Mulching, I kind of already went over. Just ensuring that that mulch isn't creating a volcano. It's away from the trunk, not too deep, so it's actually providing the benefits that it needs without holding in too much moisture and rotting the tree. Proper watering. I mentioned already that with kind of 1 inch for clay soils and the 2 inches per week for sandy soils. That's when it hasn't rained. The other big thing with watering is in-ground sprinkler systems tend to be really popular because they're really good for lawns. Unfortunately, they're not really good for trees. Trees don't like that constant barrage of water like you give your lawn. So for trees, there's a few things you can do if you have in-ground sprinklers that'll sort of kind of meet a happy midway between the two. We recommend doing it, only a couple times a week, maybe not doing it every single day. And making sure getting up, and if you have them running at night or something like that, just watching them occasionally to make sure they're actually hitting the right place. The sprinkler head shouldn't be hitting the trunk of the tree. That's going to cause a lot of fungal problems if it's actually spraying the base of the tree and things like that. And trying to go for less frequent waterings, but more long periods, so that's actually soaking into the ground and the tree is getting a lot of benefits from that. And then, of course, inspecting the root system when the tree is purchased. Again, we want to avoid girdling roots. We want to make sure that the tree is planted at the correct level. And also, I didn't mention with mulching as well. Mulching can also be really good because it reduces competition with the tree. A lot of people don't realize that grass is really good. Turf grass, especially, is really good at competing with the tree for nutrients. So by kind of getting rid of some of that grass through mulching, you're providing that tree kind of a competition-free environment where it's the only thing that's going to be taking up those nutrients, and it'll do a lot better. So there are a lot of other problems out there. If you have any questions in the future, our website has a lot of great literature. That's nfs.unl.edu. You can also email me with any pictures you have if you're seeing something that you suspect is kind of a tree health issue. I'm always happy to try and diagnose things right now by email because of the whole situation. The university's kind of on lockdown for that, but hopefully once it opens up more, we do field visits with our foresters and community foresters as well occasionally. But by all means, check those out. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me because there's a lot of other stuff out there that I couldn't cover in this time. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. That was really, really informative. Appreciate it. Now, if anybody does have any questions that were unanswered through that, feel free to type them into the Q&A really quick, and we'll probably stay on for another couple minutes or so and see them. David, can you see those questions?
Yep, I got the one. So the question is, if you have a sprinkler head that you cannot adjust, how else can you protect the trunk? I would say just trying to limit where, if that sprinkler head is hitting the tree, you could, I don't know, possibly try to put something in front of the trunk to protect it, or just limiting the amount of time that that water is actually coming into contact with the tree. I would say, and certainly if you're planting a tree and are able to really adjust the sprinkler head at all, I would make sure that that tree is outside kind of that sprinkler's direct path. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't actually, because my first thought would be to adjust the sprinkler head, but I guess if you could put up some sort of barrier or something that would do better maybe in the path of that you could put in the way of it. But yeah, definitely not good to have a sprinkler head, especially hitting that trunk of the tree. We want the tree to get the water in its root system, but hitting the trunk like that is going to cause a lot of decay.
Good to know. Very good to know. Never would have thought of that. Any other questions? Let's see, I don't see any right now. Well, David, we can stay on as long as you'd like, otherwise.
Yeah, if there's no more questions.
Let's see.
Watching the chat to make sure there's none in there.
Let's see, we've got one.
There's one here that says, my linden looks kind of sick. I was told a disease similar to ash borer will be coming through. Know anything about that? Linden can get different borers. I'm not aware of any invasive species, certainly like emerald ash borer, that would be going after it. The biggest one for lindens probably right now is the Japanese beetle, which is fairly widespread throughout Nebraska at this point. The Nebraska Department of Ag has a map of counties that they're kind of declaring as infested versus individual fines. And there's not very many counties out there that don't have a fine. So it's pretty safe to say that it's spread throughout the state at this point. That would be the biggest thing for lindens, just because they're going to defoliate them. Certainly any tree that's under stress is going to attract native borers, and there's a lot of different native borers out there. I can't think off the top of my head of anything invasive like emerald ash borer that's coming for the lindens. But I would start looking for kind of like maybe abiotic things or different, just looking at watering schedules, watching products sprayed on the lawn can have an effect on it too. Girdling roots, things like that can all kind of impact the trees. And we have another one. What tree would you recommend to plant? I'm not going to recommend one particular tree, I guess, because it depends on the situation and kind of what you're looking for. Definitely some of the ones that I went over, I wouldn't plant. I wouldn't plant an autumn blaze maple. If you have to go with a maple, there's some oriental varieties that make kind of nice ornamental maples. Also something like a sugar maple or a black maple, especially if you're in the southeast part of the state, would do pretty well. And that would get a little bit more diversity. The silver maples and the red maples really have bad branching structure too, which makes them kind of a nightmare for arborists to deal with, just as far as how they branch out. Definitely wouldn't recommend Bradford pear. Definitely not ash at this point because emerald ash borer is coming. Some ones that do really well that we don't think we see enough of, I would say tulip poplar or tulip tree. That's a tree that can grow really well, especially in eastern Nebraska. It's a really pretty tree. I wish there were more planted actually. Kentucky coffee tree does really well. You'll want to make sure you go with a seedless variety because they have some pretty massive size seed pods that they'll drop. Catalpas can be really pretty. Once again, they have seed pods, so you might want to watch for that. Hickories, we definitely don't see enough hickories, and pecans in there as well. Hickories like the shagbark hickory. I believe there are some places even selling like a shellbark hickory now. Bitternut does really well. There's a lot of different varieties of oaks. I tend not to promote oaks too much because there's quite a bit of diversity with oak species, but they are still all the same genus. The chinkapin and bur oak seem to do pretty well in Nebraska. There's a lot of different ones out there. As far as bur oak, there's actually a really cool remnant population called the relict oak that's available out there on the market. That's from a remnant population left over from the last ice age out near McCook that they discovered. So there's kind of this quite large stand of bur oaks out there. So they're a little bit better adapted to Nebraska's environment. And I think I didn't mention that in the presentation, but that's one thing we kind of recommend too, is if you're getting a tree, it's best to try and find a tree that the nursery stock has either been taken or grown in a state similar to Nebraska, or has kind of proven itself in Nebraska. A lot of trees, the species as a whole might do well in Nebraska, but if it's coming from a nursery like down in Florida or something like that, it might not be the best adapted to Nebraskan climates. So there's a lot of different trees that they're taking seed from now in like plain states and the Midwest that are a lot better adapted to Nebraska's environment. So always just asking nurseries if they have things like that, and those trees are probably going to do a lot better. But yeah, I couldn't recommend a particular tree. My favorite tree is actually eastern hemlock, which does not grow well in Nebraska. I'm from New York originally, so the biggest one that I found is about a 20-foot tall one in the Lincoln Children's Zoo. Most of the other ones that I found are little shrubs, so can't recommend that tree for Nebraska, but there's lots of great ones out there. The ones that I mentioned are just a few that we really would probably like to see a lot more of, and could definitely take the place of a lot of these ash that we're losing. What are favorite trees for native beneficial insects? That's a hard question. I would say one that we think would do better for pollinators is actually black gum. It's known as the tupelo tree. It's not particularly native to Nebraska, but it's a really great tree for pollinators. A lot of the trees out there will all do really well for native insects. One that I would not recommend for that would be the ginkgo tree. Ginkgo trees are really cool, and we sometimes joke that if there's too many invasive species, that's all we're going to have left. Ginkgo trees, because of the way they were found, they actually don't really have any pests that go after them, but they also don't really provide any ecosystem benefits either. It really depends on what kind of area you're in, but definitely something like the tupelo would be a really good one if you're looking for native pollinators or beneficial insects. Any kind of cover you can provide too when you're dealing with beneficial insects, things that are eating other pest insects, just increasing your diversity. And when you're planting things like gardens and stuff too, trying to space out what's blooming and when to provide things with a constant food source can be good. I think here's another one in the chat. When is the best time to trim? The best time to trim usually is right before spring. So in the kind of the late winter is usually when we recommend trimming. That's just because the tree's dormant at that stage and it's right before it's going to get that push in the spring. We have lots of great resources on our website about proper trimming to make sure you're not cutting into things you're not supposed to. But it's always important when you're trimming to get the tree as healthy as possible so that it's able to seal off that wound. The quicker it's able to seal off that wound, the less chance that some sort of decay or fungus is going to get in there and start causing damage. So generally, the late winter is the best time to do that. Now, if you do that with something like a maple, you're going to get quite a bit of sap weeping from it, because that's about the time that they tap for maple sugar. You can do it a little bit earlier if that's the case with maples. Usually that sap pouring out isn't going to hurt anything. You might get some sooty mold building up. It's pretty harmless. One thing that I will say, you can trim off dead stuff any time of year. So if it's dead, you can go ahead and take that out whenever. That'll actually help cut down on pest species and things like that. We don't want to trim oaks, especially red oaks, especially if you're in the southeast part of the state right now, kind of through midsummer, and that's to prevent something known as oak wilt, which is a pretty prevalent disease now. Especially, we found it in a few places in the southeast of Nebraska. It's caused by sap beetles. They carry this fungus with them, and it'll kill red oaks very quickly. And they'll actually be attracted to those cuts on oak. So we say don't trim oaks kind of starting in the spring, going through about midsummer, because that can introduce things that carry oak wilt. Not a huge problem in Nebraska, but just something to be aware of. So. Can you recommend shorter trees that are good along city streets? I actually don't have that much experience with planting for that. Definitely would recommend based on the site conditions. So especially with power lines, I think the power companies would thank you profusely if you told them you weren't planting a giant shade tree under their power lines that they're going to have to come and butcher. I mean, they do a very good job trimming them a lot of times, given what they have to do to keep the power lines safe, but it does end up doing quite a bit of damage to the tree. Just ornamental things that are not going to get very big, a lot of crab apples, different cherries. Some of those will sucker quite a bit, so that's just something to be aware of. That's just kind of the nature of the beast with those. There are some more dwarf varieties of things that you can plant under there. One, unfortunately, I wish that I could recommend more, but I can't right now, is redbud. With redbud, it's a really pretty tree, but we're seeing a lot of herbicide damage on it from what we believe is volatilizing herbicides, dicamba and 2,4-D. They really seem to be hitting redbud pretty hard. So I would probably hold off on redbud for the time being, at least until those herbicides get phased out down the road. There's a lot of shorter ornamental trees, though, that can be planted there. And of course, if you have the room, if there's no power lines and there's enough space, you can feel free to go larger as well. Always be sure to check with your township or city, because a lot of them have codes on what can be planted. Lincoln right now, I know, is not allowing, when they take down an ash, they have a list of approved trees that they're allowing people to choose from. That doesn't include things like ash, obviously, but also overplanted things like maple. They're being a little bit more selective about what gets planted. So if it's municipal property, you'd want to check with city codes and make sure everything's in line with that. How do you treat against the Japanese beetles is another question. Yeah, there's not a great way to treat against Japanese beetles. If they're in your yard and they're doing damage to your turf, there are insecticides that you can use to treat for them, and that a lot of golf courses do that. I'm not really an expert with that. You could talk to some of the turf grass people at UNL would probably be a good resource about that would know more than me. As far as Japanese beetles on trees, there really isn't that much that can be done. By the time that a lot of people see them on their trees, they've pretty much done their damage. Now, if a tree is getting hit over and over again, we have heard of a lot of arborists doing injections of systemic insecticides that will protect them against Japanese beetle. I'm kind of cautious about just the injections in general. It's a fairly new technology on the market. Seems like a really great tool, but I'm just a little more cautious because it is such a new technology and we don't really know the long-term impacts of it on tree health yet. Anytime that you do an injection, it's going to do some small amount of damage to the trunk. It also is important to be careful with those. A lot of those systemic insecticides are either neonicotinoids or emamectin benzoate, both of which are very, very toxic to pollinators. Imidacloprid is illegal to apply to any flowering plant, so that usually includes lindens, because lindens are flowering, so you can't apply to your lindens. Yeah, I wish I had better news about Japanese beetle. The good news is it'll eventually, the populations should kind of even out. Back east where I grew up, it was just kind of something we dealt with. We never saw like whole trees defoliated that often, just because the population's kind of leveled out. It might be some years out for us here yet, but I will say don't use the traps too. Those traps that they sell with the bags, those are actually too good at what they do. They contain a food lure and a sex pheromone. So they draw in a ton of beetles. And some people really like them because they kill a lot of beetles, but studies have actually shown that you're going to end up bringing more beetles to your yard. So I had a professor in school that used to joke, you get your neighbors to put them up and that protects your lawn. But don't recommend using the traps because that will draw in more. I would say just keep the tree as healthy as possible. If you do that, it should be fine, even if it's getting defoliated pretty heavily. As long as it's healthy, it's getting watered properly, mulch it. That should keep the tree healthy enough that it'll be able to recover from that. Favorite tree from appearance? Yeah, my favorite tree from appearance, I don't know. I'd still probably say Eastern hemlock. When I worked in New York State, I was actually working with parks doing a research on hemlock woolly adelgid, which is a native insect that's killing off a lot of our native hemlocks. Eastern hemlock back east in Appalachia and areas like that gets to be this gigantic, gigantic tree. And it's actually a keystone species because it provides a ton of benefits to the ecosystem. When you walk under them in the summer, it's often a few degrees cooler underneath those trees because they hold in the cool air. And in the winter, it's kind of the opposite. They hold in the warm air so well. So I'd say Eastern hemlock's probably my favorite. Sycamore, though, I really like too. Just kind of that ghostly appearance that a mature sycamore gets to in the winter is really cool. I think is that. Oh, we got a few more in chat here.
I see one more in the chat.
Do magnolias do well in Nebraska? Yeah, magnolias can do really well. We do. So usually with magnolias, we have native magnolias to the United States, and we have some of the more ornamental magnolias that tend to be from places like Korea and China and Japan. Those can do quite well. I know on East Campus, there's a lot of star and saucer magnolias that do really well. The cucumber magnolia is actually a native one that'll probably do better than most because that's fairly native to Nebraska. A lot of the more southern magnolias, kind of native to the southeast US, probably won't do as well unless you're maybe like right along the river in southeast Nebraska where your temperatures are a little bit more favorable. They probably won't survive elsewhere. The cucumber magnolia would do pretty well, and then some of those ornamental ones will do pretty well too. The big thing to watch out for with the ornamental ones is we're seeing more and more magnolia scale, which is a scale insect. They're kind of, they have piercing, sucking mouth parts, and they kind of just look like a wart on the tree when they get on there and mature. They'll kind of be pinkish or salmonish in color with the magnolia scale, and we have seen those kill quite a few trees just in the last few years. And kind of with CO2 emissions and climate change and things like that, they are predicting that scale insects and things like that could increase a lot in the future. Not something that completely prohibits you from planting a magnolia by all means. There's treatments for it. It's just something you want to watch out for and get ready to treat if you do see it. It can be treated for. Magnolias also, you might see, they'll probably survive and do just fine, but you might see those blossoms get frozen off. I know a lot of ours around Lincoln this year, they were looking really pretty for a few days, and then we got a really hard freeze, and so all their blossoms kind of turned brown and black and dead. The tree will probably be fine, but just to be aware of too that that might happen if you plant a magnolia. So. Okay, that looks like it's it.
So yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David, for
Yeah, thanks for having me. And once again, yeah, the Nebraska Forest Service website has a lot of great resources on there, especially with emerald ash borer too, because if it's not to your area yet, it's probably coming in the next few years eventually. So
Mhm. Well, we foresee it definitely. All right. Well, we'll talk later. Thank you so much for all that information today.
yep, thanks for having me.